everyone, welcome to this A-Level History EDEXCEL revision content crash course. So this is for paper 2, the rise and fall of fascism in Italy from 1911 to 46. So we're going to start with the liberal state, which is 1911 to 18. There were 4 key questions. So what were the key problems facing Italy in the early part of the 20th century? How did the government of Giolitti shape Italy's politician situation from 1911 to 14? How successful was the Liberal government in dealing with Italy's growing instability between 1912 and 14? And what was the impact on World War I on Italy? So we have our first question of what were the key problems facing Italy in the early part of the 20th century? So our first factor is the unification. Italy had only become a nation in 1861 and was fully unified in 1870. In subsequent 50 years, political leaders struggled to create an identity for this new country, and this could unite its citizens and encourage a sense of shared patriotism. Italy had been fragmented economically, politically and culturally since the Middle Ages, and the idea of Italy as a nation meant very little to Italians. Italians were defined by campanilismo, a feeling of pride and belonging to their place of birth, which is much stronger than any sense of national identity. Italy wasn't even unified by language. 99% of Italians speaking a regional dialect, along with King Victor Emmanuel II, meaning those who lived outside his region couldn't understand him. This was a clear impediment to the creation of a unified nation of Italians under the figure of the monarchy that the leaders of Risorgimento had dreamed of. Italian politician D'Azeglio had been interested in the unification, yet these hopes hadn't realised by the time Italy celebrated 50 years of unification in 1911. In May 1898, protests against Italy's political system and growing economic problems had been yet met by a brutal government crackdown, and 100 protesters were killed in Milan. And on the 29th of July, in the year 1900, King Umberto I had been assassinated by an Italian anarchist who wanted to avenge protesters' deaths. Political and economic turmoil threatened to tear apart the nation, leading to political issues being a key issue in Italy. The next key factor is the political system in Italy. I'll try to be as quick as possible. So, Italians who made up parliament were all drawn from very narrow, northern, professional, middle-class backgrounds and tended to represent the interest of their own class at the expense of the wider population. Italy's political development was also hampered by the attitude of the Church and the Roman question. Pope Pius IV, angered by the capture of Rome in 1870 and the loss of the Papal territory, and refuses to recognise the new Italian state. 1886, new Pope Leo VIII formally forbade Catholics from either running for office or voting in national elections. This robbed Italy of a potential unifying symbol and questioned the legitimacy of a new nation. Many Italian politicians feared that challenging the Church would only further alienate the population. It also prevented the creation of a national conservative party based on Catholic values, which some Italian aristocrats and conservatives had wanted to pursue. This meant that there was no parliamentary challenge to the liberal middle class who rule Italy due to the lack of popular political opposition and the fact that less than 25% of Italian men had the vote. Italian politicians shared the same liberal ideology, and that there were very few formal political parties. Prominent, I'm going to try and pronounce this, Politizanos, formed governments by offering key positions to other parliamentary members who would then agree to support them as Prime Minister. The government tended to be short-lived, as politicians could then agree to support them as Prime Minister if they were offered a better deal by any other deputy. Success as a politician was therefore not due to the ability to attract votes through popularity even, or successful policies, but instead rested on skill in forming political alliances by knowing how to buy support of other deputies. This political manoeuvring was known as transformismo, and was characterised by the frequent governmental changes. An example of this is in 1817 to 1922, 29 changes in prime ministers happened, and an ability to pass legislation that might improve the lives of Italian citizens, resulting in the majority of Italian population to be disenfranchised and were seen by liberal politicians as lacking in political education required for the electoral participation. Any protest against the government was repressed with violence from the military, fusing the division even further between real Italy, Italian people, and legal Italy, the ruling class, and the ability of most Italians to voice their anger at Italy's politicians through the ballot box fueled popular protest and the growing strength of more extreme ideologies, i.e. anarchism. Economic growth and social problems was another factor, so political alienation and anger at the ruling class was felt by many Italians, and this was a contribution to economic and social problems. So 1899 to 1914, Italy experienced considerable economic expansion and industrialisation focused in the north of the country. The iron and steel industries grew significantly along even with newer chemicals, mechanical and electrical industries. The Italian car industry was a great success along with industrialisation and improved techniques of increasing agricultural production. Despite Italy's developing economic expansion, industrialists didn't provide benefits to the wider population, and the living standards of both industrial and rural workers remained low. Protests against unemployment, food shortages, high taxation were common throughout Italy. From 1901 to 1911, there were 1,500 strikes involving nearly 350,000 workers. Industrialisation also accentuated one of Italy's most serious problems. The economic and social division between the wealthier north and the most impoverished south had concerned Italy's politicians since 1861 and was viewed as one of the major barriers in creating the unified nation they longed for. The north-south divide, so politicians were focused on the question meridionale, the question why the south was so poor compared to the north. So in northern Italy, industrialised rapidly, especially around the industrial triangle of Milan, Turin and Genoa, while the south remained poor and mainly agricultural even. So by 1911, almost half of Italy's workers were concentrated in the north, and northern incomes were about double those in the south. Southern peasants suffered from extreme poverty, malnutrition, disease, poor sanitation, and high illiteracy rates. So 250,000 people died from cholera in 1910 to 11 in the Naples. More than half of the south was illiterate, and 5 times the rate of Piedmont in the north. By 1911, income per head in the north industrial areas was double than in the south. Politicians still viewed the question of the South's poverty as the most critical issue facing Italy, but their policies, such as trying to encourage industrial investment in the Naples, failed to make any noticeable difference in improving the lives of southern peasantry and bridging the growing gap between the north and the south of Italy. Between 1903 and 1913, around 200,000 southern Italians left Italy each year, including 1 million Sicilians out of the population of only 3.5 million. 3 out of every 4 Italian who migrated to the USA came from the South, and by 1910 there were around 600,000 Italians living in New York, making its Italian population as large as any city in Italy at the time. While mass emigration did help to lessen the economic strain, in the South it failed to deal with central long-term issues facing Italy and was reliant on other countries' continual willingness to accept large influxes of poor, unskilled Italian migrants. Then we have Italy as a great power. So Italy also tended to lag behind Europe's major power in foreign policy. Italy's industrial development was behind that of Britain or Germany, while geographically it was disadvantaged by the fact that the French and the British navies dominated the Mediterranean. Italy was not an insignia and country in relation to Europe's balance of power, but tended to be viewed as the least of great powers. Italian foreign policy goals tended to focus on irredentism, due to the fact that many of the population in these areas were ethnically Italian and spoke the areas viewed as rightfully Italian, but at the time fell within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Areas were viewed as rightfully Italian, but at the same time within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italy did not have either the military power or the diplomatic means to reclaim the areas from other powerful European nations. Italy also looked to gain overseas colonies, particularly in Africa, as colonization was seen as essential for any nation wanting to claim a place as one of Europe's great powers. Here too, Italy found itself in a weaker position in comparison with other great powers. Italy had first focused on Tunisia, an area where it had particular economic and strategic interests, but in 1881 the French, with the Italian government, led to signing a defensive alliance with Austria and Germany, known as the Triple Alliance, which was aimed predominantly against France. The Triple Alliance angered many Italians as it allied with Austria, its traditional enemy, and the country was seen as the barrier to the recovery of the irredente, unredeemed lands. From 1894 onwards, Italy again sought to gain Abyssinia, but this attempt at claiming the Italian colony in Africa ended at the Battle of Adwa in March 1896, in the worst defeat ever suffered by the European power in Africa. 5,000 Italian troops were killed and thousands injured at the hands of King Menelik of Abyssinia's powerful army. The Italian Prime Minister at the time, Cripsi, had hoped that the colonization in Africa would mean of uniting Italians of all classes and regions in the patriotic pride at Italy's powerful foreign expansion, but instead humiliation of the Battle of Adwa contributed growing anger towards Italy's political class and was the catalyst for the mass protests and riots that rocked Italy at the end of the 19th century. So now we're moving on to the second question of how did the government of Giolitti shape Italy's political situation from 1911 to 14? We have the influence of Giolitti. Giolitti was the most prominent politician of the liberal era from 1903 to 14. He was the master of transformismo, and he kept files of weaknesses of every deputy in Italian parliament, so that he had a specific understanding of how to guarantee their support. He was fairly cynical about politics, believed that virtually all his opponents could be transformed into political allies if the right deal was offered. In 1911 he became Prime Minister and focused on the key goal of making Italy modern, industrialised and a successful country where masses were unified by shared values and a faith. In this focused on gaining the support of the three key oppositional forces to liberal Italy: the Socialists, the Catholic Church and the Nationalists. So we have Giolitti and the Socialists. So the main focus of the 1911 Giolitti programme was the PSI, which was formed in 1892 and later developed into a political power institution. It was one of the very few formal political parties in Italy. In the general election of 1900, it had achieved 216,000 votes and 32 deputies out of 508 parliamentary seats. By 1913 it had grown substantially, winning a quarter of its votes casting and achieving 79 deputies in parliament. Socialism in popularity mirrored Italy's industrialisation as the population in major northern cities expanded considerably due to the large internal migration, such as Milan almost doubled in size from 1818 and 1914. This urbanisation transformed Italian politics. Peasants who moved to the city encountered a new modern world that was different from the southern regions that they'd come from originally. This encouraged dissemination of political thought and increased literacy, education and awareness of political engagement, which encouraged a growth of socialism as a means for working class advancement, led by Turretti, who had lost faith in the ability of liberal politicians to achieve the dream of Risorgimento, and instead believed that socialism could solve all the problems of political corruption and widening gap between the ruling class and the masses. In contrast to liberal politicians, the members of the Italian Socialist Party were active in taking messages to Italy's poor, discussion and debates in places the poor and the working class gathered, i.e. pubs and cafes, and they promoted education. So socialism grew rapidly. By 1902, 250,000 industrial workers joined the Socialist National Federation, and a considerable amount of strike actions in pursuit for higher wages. Agricultural, 218k joined the cooperatives that had been formed in 1910. Although most of the Italian Socialist Party alarmed many liberal politicians, Giolitti tended to view it as another oppositional force that could be dealt with through transformismo. His programme focused on absorbing the socialist deputies, such as Giolitti, into political systems by offering a range of social reforms, including banning unemployment for children under 12 in 1901, limiting working days for women to 11 hours in 1902, and the most important concession to socialists in 1906, he asserted the new policy of a non-intervention in labour disputes and the establishment of ambition courts that would look to settle pay disputes between employees and employers, lowering the need for strike. These courts were welcomed by Giolitti, who viewed them as a way of gaining better pay for workers without the need of strikes. In 1911, Giolitti's programme offered one of the key socialist leaders, Bissolati, a place in the cabinet, although this was declined. Giolitti's programme was placating the PSI by offering moderate social reforms was partly successful, particularly with moderates like Giolitti, at least up to 1912, but he found it increasingly difficult to win over the entire PSI. The key issue was that the party was split between the reformists, who were prepared to work with Giolitti to bring about gradual change for the workers, and the maximalists, who believed in revolution and the violent overthrow of the state. The maximalists, which included Mussolini, despised liberal state and opposed Giolitti's reformism, believing it would undermine the party and stop the chance of real reform taking place. Despite Giolitti's social policy, he was not able to win over these powerful radical elements, and this is in turn undermined his key aim of transformismo directed towards the PSI. His compromises with the PSI also brought him into considerable conflict with the two other groups who opposed socialism, the Catholic Church and nationalists. Giolitti and the Catholic Church. So Giolitti recognised the power and the influence of the Catholic Church and was extremely careful with his dealings with this institution. In 1904, Giolitti announced that the Church and the State were two parallel lines which should never meet, clearly defining that there should always be a separation between the two institutions. Giolitti, however, was prepared to offer concessions to the Church in its return for its support, and in this sense he was successful up to a point, being the first Italian to win organised Catholic votes. This was achieved in similar ways to his absorption of the socialists by offering a series of policies and compromises that could gain the support of the Church. As Prime Minister in 1905, he allowed a divorce bill, which had been close to passing before he took office, quietly to disappear from Parliament, and promoted Catholic interests in areas such as education. Concerned with the rise of socialism, the Pope took the considerable step in 1909 of encouraging Italians to vote in around 150 constituencies where the socialists had a considerable chance of winning. When Giolitti became Prime Minister again in 1911, the cooperation between Catholics and Liberals was most evident at local level, where Catholics were part of the governing coalition in Turin, Bologna, Florence and Venice. The Catholic Church has grown its political influence through youth movements and sports clubs that had expanded considerably from 1904 to 1911. Though these groups to the Catholic Church held considerable sway over the majority of the vote, particularly in the north, Giolitti was happy to use his Catholics to improve his parliamentary majority, but while he welcomed any support the Church provided, he was not prepared actively to court a greater link with the Catholic Church. Instead, he prioritised the support of the socialists and Giolitti, believing that this was the key to encouraging the workers to support the liberal state. He was also not prepared to give the Pope any concession of the Roman territory, therefore unable to solve the Roman question, which still festered at the heart of the tension between the Church and the state. We then have Giolitti and the Nationalists. So, despite his difficulties with the church, he found that the largest threat to his programme came from a new dynamic force that was growing in the strength at the start of the 20th century. The Nationalists. Organised Italian nationalism as a political force has barely existed in 1908, but throughout Giolitti's term, it became a highly influential political movement. Nationalism was a powerful force across Europe in the early 20th century, where it tended to be more an ideological movement than an organised political party. However, in Italy, the supposed failure of the values in Risorgimento, that humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adenauer, the country's weakness as a world power, and the shame felt at the fact that millions of Italians had to leave the country in search for a better life, that the nationalist movement gained particular strength. The Nationalists were an anti-socialist, anti-liberal, and believed that only through aggression foreign policy that looked to expand Italy's power in Africa, and claimed that Irredente lands could Italy assert itself as a world power. This nationalist mission aimed to unite the differing classes of Italian people within their patriotic love for Italy and sweep away the dissecant liberal order that had failed to uphold the values and potential of Risorgimento. The nationalist movement was supported in particular by the educated middle class, who viewed it as a term of force for national renewal, which would undermine the rising popularity of socialism, bringing about a new dynamic Italy. War and expansion would overcome domestic strife by linking Italian people behind the nation. Liberal values, the national believed, only encouraged selfish individualism. Italy could not be great until Italians understood that the nation was superior ideal, which stood above shallow individual needs and were prepared to die for their country. Giolitti's attempt to work with the socialists were opposed and viewed as shallow and demonstrating the weakness and the corruption of the liberal order. In 1910, the Nationalists, so the ANI, bringing the different currents of nationalism into a more formalised organisation under the leadership of Corandini. Nationalism was a dynamic force which Giolitti found difficult. Unlike the socialists and Catholics, who were prepared to work with Parliament to an extent, the nationalists saw Giolitti and the liberal politicians as representing everything that was weak and corrupt about Italy and needed to be overthrown. Giolitti had at first attempted to boost Italians as representing everything that was weak and corrupt. Giolitti had attempted to boost Italian support for his leadership through a liberal programme of reform and economic modernisation, which he had hoped would encourage Italians to view liberals in a more positive light and therefore undermine the nationalists' growing support. This policy had failed to halt the rise of nationalism, as in a major part this was due to the fact that nationalism had a greater attraction than liberalism in its more passionate patriotic message, which promised to unite Italian people under a powerful, assertive Italy. In 1911, Giolitti pursued a different path, this time attempting to embrace nationalism by expanding Italy's empire into North Africa through the invasion of Libya. Finally, we have foreign policy. So Giolitti faced foreign policy difficulties by 1911 as Italy's interest in the Balkans clashed with Austria-Hungary's despite the Triple Alliance. Nationalists wanted a more aggressive policy towards Austria, but Giolitti instead sought to appease them through colonial expansionism in Libya. Italy had agreed in 1902 to support French expansion into Morocco in return for French recognition of Italian influence in Libya. When France had strengthened its control in Morocco in 1911, Giolitti feared it might also take Libya, creating another humiliation like Tunisia. An invasion was also gained support from the Catholic Church, which had financial interest in Libya. Giolitti therefore saw Libya as a way to win the nationalist and Catholic support and unite Italians under the liberal government. The invasion of Libya began on the 29th of September 1911 and was greeted by widespread enthusiasm, including support from socialist leader Bizzolatti, who believed it could provide a land for poor peasants. Italian naval forces captured most ports and coastal towns within 3 weeks, and 70,000 troops were committed. However, Libyans did not welcome Italian rule, and resistance made control difficult.
That's right. Italy therefore occupied 13 Ottoman islands in the Aegean Sea to pressure the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the Ottomans were fighting the Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, forcing them to surrender Libya on the 8th of October in 1912. Italy still had 50,000 troops in Libya to pacify the Arab population and suffered 3,500 deaths. Nevertheless, Libya was celebrating as a major victory that erased the shame of Adwa and showed Italy was a genuine European power. Giolitti's foreign policy therefore increased support for his government, and by 1912 his social reforms had won a lot of support of the PSI deputies in Parliament. The Catholic Church had become less hostile to the state and cooperated with the Liberals, and the Libyan victory strengthened nationalist support. However, the Libyan War and the introduction of universal suffrage.
So our second question is, how successful was the Liberal government in dealing with Italy's growing instability between 1912 and 1914? So our first factor is the impact of the invasion of Libya. The Libyan War did not help Giolitti in his attempt to absorb the nationalists. Instead, the war not only increased support for the ANI, but also accentuated their opposition to the Liberal government. The nationalists took credit for the war, claiming that Giolitti had only launched it under pressure from their movement. They denounced the Liberals, blaming their weakness and lack of patriotism as the reason why Italy's army had lost so many men during the fighting. More critically, the Libyan War destroyed Giolitti's cooperation with the PSI, which had been formed the key basis for his programme of Transformismo. The PSI opposed the war as militarism. More radical socialists, who had been angered by the growing compromise with the Liberals in Parliament, expelled those members who had supported war, such as Bissolati. The revolutionary wing of the party seized control and rejected further cooperation with Giolitti even, with the more moderate members of the PSI isolated and unable to influence party policy. Mussolini was appointed editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti, which focused its campaign on the corrupt liberal order and militarists who had murdered workers both in Libya and Italy. Giolitti's attempt at absorbing the socialists into the liberal state had ended in failure. We then had the impact of the franchise extension of 1912, where Giolitti's problems were accentuated by the changes to the suffrage in Italy, which he had made part of the government programme in 1911. Previously, the vote was restricted to literate men over the age of 21, but now it was difficult to deny the vote to Italy's conscript soldiers who were fighting in Libya, many who did not require literacy level to enable them to vote. Consequently, in 1912, a new law was passed that extended the vote to all men who had completed military service and all men aged 30 and over, regardless of literacy. Despite the concern that now around 70% of Italy's voters were potentially illiterate, Giolitti had hoped that the increased suffrage would promote greater national unity, increase the popularity of Liberals and strengthen the vote in the rural areas, which tended to be more conservative than industrial cities where the PSI were popular. He also believed that increased suffrage would undermine the PSI, as with greater electoral representation, the working class would be less inclined to support more radical ideologies. I'll try and sum this one up shorter. So, the resignation of Giolitti, first election under the new suffrage in 1913, demonstrated the overall failure of Giolitti's strategy. Liberal deputies won only 318 seats, a loss of 71 seats from the 1909 election, with the Socialists, Nationalists and Radical and Catholics making gains. However, the critical problem was with the Liberals linked to the Catholic Church. The president of the Catholic Union, Gentilini, had secretly asked Liberal candidates to agree to 7 points, mainly on religious education and divorce law, in return for the Catholic vote. Gentiloni boasted after the election that around 228 Liberal deputies of 318 owed their victory to Catholic support. Giolitti claimed that he knew nothing of the pact, but regardless of whether this was not true, the Liberal regime found themselves more and more reliant on support from the Catholic Church. Italy was becoming more ideologically polarised, and Giolitti's attempt to unite oppositional groups within the liberal system using Transformismo was now impossible. His concession to the Catholic Church angered both socialist and anti-clerical liberals within Parliament. 1914, they withdrew their support from Giolitti, following Count Gentiloni's claims concerning the pact that Giolitti chose to resign. This in turn infuriated the Catholics, who had felt that with the anti-church faction in government gone, Giolitti could have formed a new pro-Catholic bloc that pursued policies in line with the Catholic Church's teaching. Again, the growth of nationalism and socialism, Giolitti's programme of the deal-making and attempting to bring oppositional forces within the Liberal Parliament system floundered under the mass suffrage that had been so eager to promote. Instead, mass suffrage meant mass parties, and both nationalists and Catholics found the powers of religion and patriotism were the most dynamic focuses in gaining support of Italian people. Giolitti was replaced by Salandra, who believed he could revive liberalism by linking it more closely to nationalism. However, by June 1914, Italy was back again in turmoil. PSI proclaimed a national strike after 3 protesters were shot dead by the police in Ancona. Anarchists, Republicans and other radicals joined in. For a week, most of the northern and central Italy was in chaos as public buildings were torched, tax registers destroyed and hundreds of workers lost their lives in battles against authority, and Italy appeared to be on the verge of revolutionary. This is called Red Week, and it ended after the trade unions agreed to call off the strike, but the riots had demonstrated to Salandra that the difficulty of achieving national unity. Instead, Italian society appeared more divided on class and on ideological ground than at any time since the unification. And the Declaration of Neutrality in 1914, so August 1940, World War I erupted. Italy, despite being part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary since 1882, declared neutrality. This was because Austria-Hungary had not consulted Italy before attacking Serbia, releasing Italy from its treaty obligations. The decision sparked major political division within Italy. Many, including Giolitti, argued Italy was economically unprepared after the Libyan War and could benefit more by negotiating from neutral stance, while the nationalist press pushed for intervention. The majority of Italians and non-interventionist politicians supported staying out of the conflict. So then we have the question on what was the impact on the First World War on Italy. So the intervention crisis, where Italy's declaration of neutrality in 1940s split opinion of liberals in Parliament, setting a political crisis concerning Italy's possibility intervention in war. Prime Minister Salandra argued that Italy should be joining war, fearing if Germany and Austria-Hungary won, they would not be sympathetic to an ally who failed to come to their side at critical times. However, if Britain and France were victorious, Italy hadn't assisted them in efforts. They wouldn't be open to discussing Italy's ambitions in the Mediterranean. Salandra saw war as a chance to impose authoritarian rule. By 1915, he and his foreign minister, Sonnino, secretly negotiated with both sides. The Entente offered the best deal, promising Italy significant territorial gains like South Tyrol, Trentino, Istria and Trieste, and much of Dalmatia. Italy then signed the Treaty of London in April 1915, committing to join the Entente. However, many, including socialists and Catholics, opposed intervention. Reports from the local officials in April 1915 confirmed that most Italians feared war and had little interest in territorial expansion or fighting for Austria. And in early May 1915, Italy faced a crisis over entering World War I. Giolitti and many deputies opposed joining the war and the Treaty of London. Pro-war rallies occurred, and Mussolini was expelled from the Socialist Party for advocating intervention. Salandra resigned, and the king asked Giolitti to form a new government. However, the king was committed to the Treaty of London and threatened to abdicate it if it wasn't honoured. Giolitti declined, unwilling to go against the king. Salandra was reinstated as Prime Minister on May 16th, granted the emergency power on May 20th, and Italy formally declared war on Austria on May 25th. So the defeat at Caporetto was when, in 1916, Austrian army launched Strafe Expedition, a major offence in the Trentine salient, in order to open a path that would allow it to attack Verona and Bologna. Though the Italian army was able to regroup and Austrian attack, it had severe impact on army and public morale. Salandra was forced to resign and replaced by Bosselli, but military's efforts hardly improved. Situation reached its lowest point when Italy's defeated by the Austro-Hungarian forces at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. The poor ship and morale saw that Italian army dissolve quickly in the faces of the Austrian forces, and a humiliating and chaotic retreat took place. What was the initial victory for Austrians turned quickly into a rout as Italian soldiers streamed down the mountains, many without weapons, and thought that war was now over. 200,000 soldiers were lost contact with their regiments. Large quantities of military arms were lost, as was the majority of the Veneto region. The action of Italy troops in the face of Austrian offence was an embarrassment to Italy's leadership. In total, 10,000 Italians were killed, 30,000 wounded, and 300,000 taken prisoner. 400,000 simply vanished, in most cases, to head back to their homes in Italy. The defeat revealed the poor state of the army and prompted significant and grand debate within Italy. The defeat was a turning point for the Italian nation. Thoughts of an easy victory would allow it to take Trente and Trieste disappeared now. Italy was fighting for survival. So the Caporetto reignited the division that had surfaced during arguments on intervention in 1914 and 15, and a majority of Italy's parliament still backed Giolitti and were not come to see behind the wall was to blame for Italy's poor military performance, and there was the course for revolution from many nationalists. Following Caporetto, Boselli resigned and was replaced by Orlando, along with Cardona removed and replaced by General Diaz. Rations for soldiers were raised, annual leave was increased. There was a greater focus on boosting soldier morale through lectures and trench newspapers. Diaz was a much more cautious commander, focusing on Italian line at Piave and avoiding the needle sacrifice of soldiers in suicidal offences. Casualty rates fell from 520,000 in 1917 to 200, that's supposed to say 143,000, not whatever that number says, I'm so sorry, in 1918. So, the socialist response to war, the PSI continued to oppose the war, refusing to vote for war credits in Parliament, declaring a policy of neither support or sabotage the war efforts. Its view was despised by many nationalist and noble supporters who saw it as a defeatist and anti-Italian, blaming it for its poor performance of military in Italy. The hysteria after Caporetto against defeatists who had stabbed it in the back to the arrest and imprisonment of many PSI leaders. Mussolini himself blamed Italian socialists, asserting that they were a more dangerous enemy than the Austrians, and calling for a more peaceful and forceful Italian leader who would help create a united country. PSI position on the war was even greater polarisation between the left and the right in Italian politics. The war and economy costs. Steel production was less than 1 million tonnes, while Austrians were at 2.6 million. For every 2 machine guns per Italian battle with the Austrians had 12, and Italy was short on artillery and bullets. So I'm going to let you guys read the rest of that, and I'm just going to skip to statistics. So a quarter of munition factories' employees were women, and a third of Italy's workers, so 900,000, in the water economies were either men accepted from the military service or on the secondment from the army. So I'm going to do the same for these 2 bits. So I'm just going to pause the video, extend each section and let you guys read it, as the video is now getting quite long. In the next 2 videos, 3 even, I'll be talking about... Give me one sec. I will be talking about the rise of Mussolini and the creation of fascism, the fascist state and challenges to and for the fascist state. So stay tuned.